Picture this: 80,000 Roman soldiers, packed so tightly they can't lift their swords, being slaughtered from all sides by an enemy half their size. Imagine the most disciplined army in the ancient world, reduced to screaming, desperate men trampling their own comrades in panic. In the next few minutes, I'll show you how one man's tactical genius turned Rome's greatest army into history's most perfect massacre. But first, you need to understand the childhood oath that made this annihilation possible. A 9-year-old boy named Hannibal placed his hand on a sacred altar and swore never to be a friend of Rome. The priests watched in silence as this child spoke words that would echo through eternity. What the Romans didn't know was that this promise would reshape the ancient world in the most devastating way imaginable. The flames danced higher as the words left his lips, casting shadows that seemed to prophesy the darkness he would bring to Rome. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had been humiliated by Roman treachery. They had torn Sicily from Carthage, like vultures picking at a carcass, imposed crushing tribute that bled the empire white, and humiliated the proud merchant princes who had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. The defeat still burned in Hamilcar's soul, and now he was passing that flame to his son. But the Barcid family never forgot their enemies, and they never forgave their losses. As Hannibal grew to manhood in the mountains of Spain, that sacred promise became his obsession. Every morning, he woke thinking of Rome's destruction. Every sword stroke he practiced was aimed at a Roman heart. Every battle he studied revealed new ways to break Roman formations. Every tactical innovation he developed had one purpose: the annihilation of his father's enemies. In the hills of Spain, conquering tribe after tribe for Carthage, he wasn't just building an empire, he was forging himself into the perfect weapon for revenge. By 218 BCE, that boy had become Rome's worst nightmare. Picture the terror in Roman streets when messengers brought impossible news. Hannibal had crossed the Alps. But here's what made the Romans panic. Hannibal had done the impossible, marched an army across the Alps in winter, and brought war to Italy itself. The crossing was a horror of avalanches, freezing temperatures, and tribal attacks that killed more than half his force. Men froze to death in their sleep, elephants plummeted into crevasse. Entire units vanished in blizzards. But those who survived this nightmare became something more than soldiers. They became fanatics, bound to their commander by shared suffering and impossible victory. They had walked through hell itself and emerged believing their leader could achieve anything. He had already crushed Roman forces twice with tactical brilliance that left the capital shaking. At Trebia, he lured an entire army into an ambush, using the bitter cold and Roman aggression against them. 15,000 Romans died in icy water, while Hannibal's men watched from dry ground. At Lake Trasimene, he achieved something that seemed impossible: complete tactical surprise against Roman scouts, annihilating 15,000 legionaries in morning fog, so thick they died without ever seeing their killers. Entire cohorts marched straight into the lake and drowned in their armor. But what Rome did next would be the biggest mistake in military history. They didn't retreat or negotiate. They didn't sue for peace or offer tribute. Instead, they raised the largest army they had ever assembled. 80,000 men, 8 full legions, every ally called to arms. This was overwhelming force, designed to crush any foreign pretender, once and for all. Think about that number. 80,000 professional soldiers, more than many entire cities. It was an army that could have conquered most kingdoms of the ancient world. The mobilization was unprecedented in scope and scale. From every corner of the Roman world, men answered the call. Veterans who had fought in Gaul marched alongside fresh recruits who had never seen battle. Italian allies contributed their finest warriors. The Roman war machine, built over centuries of conquest, was finally operating at full capacity. The sight of this army on the march must have been terrifying, a river of bronze and steel flowing across the Italian countryside. The cost was staggering, more than Rome had ever spent on a single campaign, but the Senate was beyond calculating expenses. This Carthaginian upstart had dared invade Italy itself, had dared to threaten the very heart of their empire. The time for half measures was over. They would bring such overwhelming force that no tactical genius, no matter how brilliant, could possibly survive. But here's where it gets interesting. Leading this massive army were two consuls who couldn't agree on anything. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the experienced one, wanted caution, knowing Hannibal was dangerous and unpredictable. He had seen what happened to armies that underestimated this Carthaginian. But Gaius Terentius Varro, burning with ambition, saw only numbers 80,000 Romans against maybe 50,000 barbarian mercenaries. To him, victory was inevitable. How could disciplined Roman legions possibly lose to a ragtag collection of foreigners? This tension would prove disastrous. Command alternated daily between the two leaders, creating confusion and conflicting strategies where there should have been unified confidence. On days when Paulus commanded, the army moved cautiously, seeking advantageous ground. When Varro held command, they advanced aggressively, hunting for battle. The mixed signals filtered down through the ranks. Centurions received contradictory orders. Soldiers didn't know whether to prepare for siege warfare or pitched battle. An army that should have been Rome's ultimate weapon was already fracturing before it ever saw the enemy. Hannibal watched this chaos with the patience of a master hunter studying wounded prey. His network of spies brought detailed reports of every Roman movement, every argument between the consuls, every shift in strategy. Local guides told him which roads the Romans used, which camps they preferred, even what time they usually broke camp each morning. He had been planning for this moment his entire life, studying every aspect of Roman military doctrine, and he knew exactly where he wanted to face Rome's greatest army. What happens next will break every rule of ancient warfare. Near the town of Cannae, Hannibal chose ground that looked perfect for Romans' rolling plains, where superior numbers could deploy in traditional formations. Open space where disciplined legions could maneuver freely. To Roman scouts examining the terrain, it appeared exactly where disciplined legions would triumph over barbarian rabble. The land seemed to favor everything Romans did best: organized formations, coordinated advances, the methodical destruction of less disciplined enemies. But Hannibal wasn't planning a traditional battle. He was setting the most sophisticated trap in military history, and he needed the Romans to feel confident, aggressive, even overconfident. Every detail of this seemingly simple battlefield served his greater purpose. The Aufidus River curved nearby, providing water for both armies while subtly limiting retreat routes. The direction of the prevailing winds had been calculated. They would blow dust and sand directly into Roman faces as they advanced, while giving his own men clear vision. Even the rolling nature of the ground would help conceal his troop movements until the crucial moment. Every detail served his purpose, and the Romans saw none of it. But here's what the Romans couldn't see. His army looked like exactly what they expected: African veterans at the core, but mostly Spanish and Gallic warriors who seemed undisciplined by Roman standards. They moved in loose formations, shouted in different languages, carried mismatched weapons. His cavalry were lightly armed horsemen who appeared no match for Roman heavy infantry. To Roman eyes, it was a typical barbarian horde held together by one man's charisma. These were carefully crafted deceptions. The Gallic warriors, while lacking Roman drill precision, possessed a fierce courage forged in generations of tribal warfare and intimate knowledge of close combat that Romans had never experienced. The Spanish fighters brought decades of brutal mountain wars where only the most cunning and vicious survived. His Numidian cavalry were perhaps the finest horsemen in the world, mobile, deadly accurate with javelins, and perfectly suited to the role Hannibal had planned for them. On paper, it was precisely the mixed barbarian force that Roman legions had been crushing for centuries across Gaul, Spain, and Africa. In reality, it was a carefully crafted killing machine, where every component had been selected for a specific tactical purpose. The night before battle, Hannibal did something that shattered every principle of ancient warfare. Every military manual, every tactical tradition, every lesson learned in centuries of combat said the same thing: put your best troops in the center, where they can break the enemy line. Instead, he put his weakest units there, the Spanish and Gallic warriors who looked least like professional soldiers. His elite African infantry, veterans who could match any Roman legion in discipline and skill, he hid on the flanks, disguised among lighter troops. He spent hours personally positioning each unit, walking the lines in darkness, explaining to his officers the crucial timing required for his plan to succeed. The Spanish and Gallic warriors in the center had to retreat at exactly the right pace, fast enough to appear beaten and draw the Romans forward, slow enough to maintain formation and avoid actual collapse. Too fast, and they'd break for real. Too slow, and the Romans would suspect a trap. His African veterans on the flanks had to remain invisible until the perfect moment, then execute a complex wheeling maneuver with precision that would make Roman drill instructors weep with envy. To Roman observers across the field, studying enemy positions by torchlight, it looked like standard barbarian deployment, the usual disorganized mass with the strongest fighters bunched in the middle. But every detail was calculated for maximum devastation. Hannibal was turning Roman expectations into weapons against them. In 60 seconds, 80,000 Romans would realize they'd walked into a death trap designed by the greatest tactical mind in history. The morning of August the 2nd, 216 BCE, dawned scorching hot with omens of doom. A brutal Mediterranean wind blew directly into Roman faces as they advanced, carrying clouds of grit that made seeing difficult and breathing harder. Even the weather seemed to have chosen sides. The heat was already oppressive at dawn, promising a day of brutal temperatures that would sap the strength of heavily armored Roman legionaries long before the fighting ended. 80,000 Romans advanced in their legendary formation, dense columns of heavy infantry, shields locked, spears forward, the disciplined march that had conquered half the known world. The aggressive consul Varro rode at their head, finally having his day of command, ready to show Rome how real leaders dealt with foreign pretenders. This was his moment of destiny. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. 8 full legions moved with mechanical precision across the dusty plain, their bronze and iron gleaming in the morning sun like a river of metal. Standards fluttered above disciplined ranks, each bearing the proud history of victories across Europe and Africa. The ground trembled under the weight of so many armored men moving in perfect unison, and their war chants echoed across the battlefield. No barbarian army had ever faced such overwhelming force. Behind the main battle line came the support troops, engineers, medical personnel, ammunition bearers, all the infrastructure of the most sophisticated military machine in the ancient world. This wasn't just an army, it was a mobile civilization designed to crush anything in its path. The battle began with the thunderous clash of 130,000 men colliding like 2 avalanches. The Roman center, 8 legions deep and unstoppable as a landslide, smashed into Hannibal's deliberately weak line of Spanish and Gallic warriors. The sound was unlike anything in human experience. Thousands of shields crashing into swords, the screams of men and horses, the snap of breaking spears. Exactly as planned, his center began to give way, falling back in what looked like panic to Roman eyes. The initial impact was devastating and seemingly decisive. Roman shields crashed into barbarian weapons, with a sound like thunder rolling across the plains. The Spanish and Gallic warriors, following Hannibal's careful instructions, began their fighting retreat. They had to make it look realistic, desperate men being overwhelmed by superior Roman discipline and numbers. Real warriors died to maintain this illusion. Spanish swordsmen fell back step by step, their wild cries of apparent panic masking the careful control of their withdrawal. To the consul Varro watching from behind the advancing legions, it appeared like perfect victory unfolding exactly as he had promised the Senate. His men were driving the barbarians back like wheat before a scythe, pushing inexorably toward Hannibal's position, moments from breaking the enemy army completely and ending this war forever. But here's what the Romans didn't see coming. As their center pushed forward, becoming increasingly compressed and unwieldy in pursuit of the retreating enemy, something extraordinary was happening on the flanks. Hannibal's hidden African veterans began to move like the closing jaws of a trap. These were not the wild tribesmen the Romans had been fighting. These were disciplined professionals, veterans of a dozen campaigns, the finest heavy infantry outside of Rome itself. They had been waiting in perfect stillness, watching their comrades in the center die to maintain the deception, holding their positions until this exact moment. Like closing jaws engineered by a master architect, his best troops wheeled inward from both flanks with mechanical precision. The Romans, packed tight in their advancing columns and focused entirely on the retreating enemy ahead, suddenly found elite enemy soldiers attacking their sides. Warriors appeared who fought with Roman-style discipline but Carthaginian fury, cutting into the exposed flanks of legions that had never imagined they could be outmaneuvered. The tactical situation was transforming with breathtaking speed that left Roman officers stunned and helpless. Roman centurions, realizing something was terribly wrong but unable to see the full scope of the disaster unfolding around them, began shouting contradictory orders. Some tried to wheel their formations to meet the new threat. Others attempted to maintain the advance. Still others called for immediate retreat. The result was chaos where there had been perfect order, confusion where there had been confidence. Then Hannibal's cavalry, having quickly scattered the outnumbered Roman horsemen in a display of tactical superiority that left no doubt about their skill, swept around to attack from behind, like wolves falling on a wounded deer. In minutes, the tactical situation reversed completely. The Romans weren't advancing to glorious victory, they were surrounded, trapped, doomed. Hannibal had achieved the double envelopment, the perfect maneuver that generals had dreamed of for centuries, but never successfully executed on such a massive scale. Then Hannibal did something no general had ever attempted on such a scale. 80,000 Romans found themselves completely encircled by 50,000 Carthaginians, in what military historians would later call the most perfect tactical execution in recorded history. The proud legions that had conquered nations became a trapped, desperate mob, pressed together so tightly they could barely lift their weapons. They were being cut down from all sides like grain in a field, their legendary discipline useless in the face of tactical genius. The psychology of the moment was as devastating as the tactics themselves. Roman soldiers, trained from childhood to believe in their invincibility and the superiority of their methods, suddenly found themselves helpless against an enemy they had dismissed as barbarians. The disciplined formations that had carried them to victory across the known world became death traps. Every instinct they possessed, every piece of training they had received, became useless in this nightmare scenario. Individual acts of heroism emerged from the chaos like stars in darkness. Roman officers, understanding that death was inevitable but determined to die with honor, rallied small groups of men for desperate last stands. Centurions with decades of service fell defending standards that would never return to Rome, their final moments embodying everything noble about Roman military culture, even as that culture was being systematically destroyed around them. The experienced consul Paulus died fighting in the ranks with his men, refusing to flee even when the battle was clearly lost. His final stand would be remembered as the perfect example of Roman leadership, a commander who shared the fate of his soldiers rather than abandoning them to save himself. The aggressive consul Varro, who had engineered this disaster through his arrogance and ambition, abandoned the field in disgrace. His escape would haunt him for the rest of his life, a living reminder of how pride and overconfidence had led Rome to its greatest military catastrophe. For hours under the blazing Mediterranean sun, the slaughter continued with relentless efficiency. The heat became unbearable for men trapped in bronze armor. Warriors died of thirst and exhaustion as much as wounds. The dust kicked up by 130,000 struggling warriors created a choking fog that made breathing difficult and seeing nearly impossible. Blood soaked into the dry earth until the plain became a muddy crimson swamp that sucked at the feet of the dying. When it finally ended as the sun reached its zenith, 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead across the plains of Cannae. Another 10,000 were captured, destined for slavery or ransom. In a single day, Rome had lost more men than in any battle in its 1,000-year history. Entire legions had been wiped from existence. Families across Italy would never see their sons and fathers again. As sunset painted the battlefield the color of blood, Hannibal stood among the carnage and surveyed his masterpiece. The scene was apocalyptic bodies stretched to the horizon, proud Roman eagles trampled into the gore-soaked earth, the pride of the Republic's military might reduced to carrion for scavengers. The boy who had sworn never to be a friend of Rome had just delivered the worst military disaster in Roman history. His childhood oath had been kept in the most devastating way possible, and the ancient world would never be the same. His officers begged him to march on Rome immediately, to finish what he had started while the city was paralyzed with shock. "Give me 5 days," his cavalry commander said, "and you will dine in the capital itself." But Hannibal refused. Whether from caution or miscalculation, he chose consolidation over immediate conquest. It would prove to be the decision that ultimately saved Rome. The news sent shockwaves across the ancient world. Cities began defecting to Carthage. Enemy kingdoms declared war on Rome. For a brief moment, it looked like Roman power might collapse entirely. But Rome did something no one expected. They didn't surrender or negotiate. Instead, they did what Romans had always done in crisis. They endured, adapted, and prepared to fight again. The Senate declared that defeat was merely temporary. They began the largest military mobilization in Roman history, freeing slaves to serve in new legions, calling up every reserve. The message was clear: Rome would never surrender. For Hannibal, his greatest triumph became the beginning of his ultimate failure. He had proven his tactical brilliance beyond doubt, but he had also shown Rome exactly how dangerous he was. The Romans would never again give him the chance for another decisive battle on his terms. Eventually, Rome took the war to Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. At Zama, facing a Roman general who had studied his tactics and learned from Cannae, Hannibal finally tasted defeat. But his masterpiece lives on. For over 2,200 years, commanders have studied this battle. Napoleon called it the most perfect tactical achievement in military history. Modern military academies still dissect every aspect, teaching future officers that superior strategy can overcome superior numbers. Today, when military generals want to describe the perfect battle, they use one word: Cannae. Not because of the numbers, not because of the strategy, but because one man's childhood promise became 50,000 Roman nightmares. That 9-year-old boy who swore never to be Rome's friend, he kept his word in the most devastating way imaginable.